Welcome. dis&datInformation, 25 July 2025. We're not changing direction. We're just simply moving along the same line. You'll note that the last couple of things have referenced both the theories of surplus value and Marx's Grundrisse, and we've been fiddling around with a couple of notions about how is it that Marx develops the notion of surplus value. And ultimately what we're going to get at is, and it's already been done by a couple of folks, as I think you've sort of noticed, and that is relationship between Department 1 and 2, if you accept that idea, and sort of the details during which, or employing which, Marx and more recent folks have been sorting out the difference between a surplus value built on something that is not necessarily congealed labor, and what is the difference between congealed labor and unpaid labor, for example, as well as some other elements that are not as are less mediated, let's put it that way. And hence we get into an issue with the unpaid labor of how is it that in other forms, value forms, we get, how is it that we calculate or think about surplus value? Is it always reducible? Is it reducible to labor? Or is it a relation to an abstract relation, because you've already made the abstraction, to some other thing that creates a kind of indexical, a set of indexical signs that can support the notion of difference, that is, the difference that creates exploitation or immiseration, and that those are not as qualitative as we may think. In fact, that I think that you can actually see, as some people have looked at, the quantitative components of it, and not to get so, caught up into this humanist, anti-humanist, or humanist social science kind of problem amid, the fact is, so many people don't think about necessarily the social science so much as they think about social science as one scientific component. But as I think you saw with Anwar Sheikh, is that it's probably better at certain moments to just talk about physics and not screw around with some other kind of thing that doesn't fully address some of the methodological problems. So that's the reason why we're sort of sampling through some of this, partially because there is a body of research that still discusses, after 150 plus years, the Grundrisse, as well as other things that got sort of munched up or retransformed, as it were, by Engels in the subsequent editing of Marx's volumes 1, 2, and 3 of Capital, and whatever you want to discover in terms of the theories of surplus value. So that's kind of where we're headed. And it may be a little circuitous and torturous, but tortured, but I hope you'll find it useful. So this is from a edited edition, Karl Marx's Grundrisse, Foundations of the Critique of Political Economy, 150 years later, edited by Marcello Musto at York. As I recall, the discovery of the category of surplus value, Enrique de Sel. The surplus value, Mehrwert, which capital has at the end of the production process, a surplus value which is a higher price of the product, is realized only in circulation, but like all prices, is realized in it by already being ideally presupposed to it, determined before they enter into it, signifies, expressed in accord with the general concept of exchange value, that the labor time objectified in the product or amount of labor expressed passively, the magnitude of labor appears as a amount of space, but expressed in motion, it is measurable only in time. All of that is greater than that which was present in the original components of capital. Now, this, in turn, is possible only if the labor objectified in the price of labor is smaller than the living labor purchased with it. So that's a kind of interesting notion about talking about ratios. That's all Marx. This is how one of the most critical passages of the Grundrisse begins. In these lines, we can see the difficulty implied by a reflection on the issue that concerns us here. That is, the problem of the order of categories in Marx's research and exposition. Marx's marked tendency is to move from the simplest to the most complex, from the deepest to the most superficial level, from the abstract to the concrete. But the issue of surplus value requires a recourse to both simple and complex categories, to questions relating to the deepest levels of the production processes and to more superficial ones, such as the processes of circulation. I think this was addressed. Let me break here for a second and say, this is addressed, I'd like to think, by the writings of Chris Arthur. And I hope you appreciated how that was worked out in on the one hand, a kind of structural approach. On the other hand, it had mathematical implications. And so it had a certain consistency to it. In the text above, Marx mentions the culmination or end of the process of production at the deep, non-visible level. But he then immediately goes on to write about the price of the product at the superficial level in the context of circulation. It is well known that all prices associated with circulation are previously budgeted or defined in the process of production in labor time, which is greater than that which was there in the original components of capital. The text concludes with a discussion on the sale and purchase of living labor. That's the deep level of production, and on the price of labor, that is wages, in the context of circulation. So, you can see there's production and departments 1 and 2 are there. Perhaps for this reason, Marx eventually decides to include his treatise on wages in volume 1 of Capital, despite having originally assigned it an independent place as the third volume of its initial plan, between the volume on landed property and the one on the state. Now, the question of surplus value cannot be grasped without first addressing the issue of wages, understood as the price of labor. Although situated at the level of production, surplus value is only fully realized in the process of circulation because of its necessary antecedent, that is wages, and its subsequent development, the accumulation of greater value through the sale of the product. So we saw some of this engaged in a couple of things that we've read before last week or beginning of this week, and addressing this kind of issue, that kind of difference between Department 1 and Department 2, and that there is a kind of structure that can be described that, as it were, kind of gets bogged down in at what moment in the path is it being transformed, whatever that might mean. So let's try this again. Except DeSalle, who, the reason why DeSalle is important is because of his relationship to, of course, Latin American development issues. All right. Surplus labor lies at the foundation of surplus value. Now, this concept of surplus labor, of course, is already an abstraction by definition. Marx intuitively grasps the problem of surplus value in his economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, but starts developing the categories of its explicit formulation much later. So the first appears in Notebook 8 of his notes, dated April 1851, when, commenting on Ricardo's work, he writes, quote, In order for the value of profit to increase, there has to be a third whose value diminishes. When it is said that the capitalist spends 30 of those 100 on raw materials, 20 on machinery, 50 on salary, and then sells those 100 for 110, it's not taken into account that if he had to disperse 60 for salary, he would have obtained no profit at all, unless he had garnered another 8.2% in addition to the 110, etc. He thereby exchanges his product for another whose value is determined by the labor time invested in it. The surplus does not emerge from the process of circulation, although it can only be fully realized in that context. So there's this kind of, mystery area where this might exist that is only defined, obviously, by, questions that relate to motion and etc. The value of the wages is reduced in a manner directly proportionate to the increase in the productive forces of labor. This quote evidences the transition from an intuitive understanding of the question of surplus value to a clearer expression of the categories involved. It is not until the Grundrisse, that is the availability of the book, the Grundrisse, however, that we find the first elaboration of the category of surplus value in its definitive form, although further improvements to it are made in the following decade. First, we need to point out that the categorical distinction between absolute and relative absolute value and relative absolute surplus value and relative surplus value, the categorical distinction is initially far from clear. This is of particular significance because the concept of surplus value is applied first and foremost to relative surplus value rather than its absolute expression. So it's more of an internal as opposed to an external kind of expression. Similarly, the initial descriptions of all the key concepts of the theory of wages and of the various forms of capital, industrial capital, commercial capital, and long before that, fixed and variable capitals, that were being conceptualized along the way do not exhibit the degree of clarity characteristic of his later treatment of them in Capital, the book. But let us venture into the river of ideas where Marx slowly constructs his categories with all of its ebbs and flows. Surplus value emerges as the outcome of an unequal exchange between capital and labor, whereby the labor process as such, that is the process that produces capital, transforms capital into productive capital that reproduces itself in a process of valorization. Now, classical political economy had confused this with profit. That's, the hinge point for many people talking about this. Marx then needs to ascend from this point of departure at the level of circulation, profit, to the level of production, surplus labor, in order to create the theoretical conditions necessary to discover the foundation of surplus value in its essential context. Quote Marx, if living labor reproduced only the labor time objectified in the labor price, this would also be merely formal. But no matter that for the worker, the exchange between capital and labor, whose result is the price of labor, is a simple exchange. As far as the capitalist is concerned, it has to be a not exchange, not dash exchange. He has to obtain more value than he gives. Now, looked at from the capitalist side, the exchange must be only apparent, shine bar, i.e., must belong to an economic category other than exchange. So there is this categorical difference that, you could argue that it mystifies. It is part of the thing about what you want out of this entire economic set of relations. Now, close quote, what is at issue is precisely that other kind of formal economic determination that Marx describes as surplus value. In ideological terms, capitalist economists take refuge in this simple process in order to construct a legitimation, Rechtfertigen, an apology for capital by explaining it with the aid of the very process which makes its existence impossible. So that's, humanistically intriguing, but problematic. This is just another example of how scientific disciplines such as economics can be contaminated by ideology. Although even the critical sciences tend to be less ideological when articulated with processes of liberation of the oppressed, at least in structural terms, they may still wind up being equally ideological in practice. If this were the case, Marx asks, where does the increased value come from? If classical political economists were right, capital would be impossible. If they were to explain that capital does not pay the worker the equivalent of the totality of her objectified labor, they would be unveiling its ethical perversity, thereby giving rise to a critical contradiction between capitalist theory and capitalist practice. The capitalist economist is left with no other alternative than becoming an apologist for the system, which requires that he conceals reality. By not articulating his praxis with the interests of capital, Marx displays an intelligence that is both freer and more clearly determined. Marx again, in quotes. Surplus value in general is value in excess of the equivalent. The equivalent, by definition, is only the identity of value with itself. Hence, surplus value can never sprout out of the equivalent, nor can it do so originally out of circulation. It has to arise from the production process of capital itself. So what you're defining here is, of course, the departments and this kind of structural relation among all of them. The equivalent, toison, for Aristotle, denotes what is fair, equal, or of identical value in a relationship with each term in the exchange being held equal. Capital does not give its own equivalent in praxis, although it appears to deliver the same in the face of consciousness. Now, in reality, in fact, it gives less, whilst in its phenomenological appearance, it is fair and equal. The sheer power of capitalism with respect to other modes of wealth production is evidenced in its characteristic ideological duplicity. This is reflected in its presentation of the relationship between labor and capital at the superficial level of circulation as one of equal exchange, whilst in fact at the deep level of production, it is a social process that coerces and violently compels the worker to establish a wholly unequal exchange. Surplus value is a category explained by other more fundamental ones, whilst explaining more superficial categories such as profit. It thus needs to be explicitly and clearly constructed in order to express and explain the apparent equality of an inequality. The first quote of this chapter ought to be understood in this context. There, Marx is exploring the question of surplus value in all its depth and complexity. The category of surplus value is a formal economic determination, which is to say, it is not situated at the first material level of the productive process, except insofar as it has been subsumed and determined by capital. Unlike objectified labor, it is not a material determination. It is formal in character and in economic terms, for example, when related to prices. Furthermore, it is an extremely complex category because it includes many other simpler, abstract, and fundamental categories, such as currency, commodities, and labor as determinations of capital and necessary labor, which is the foundation of the development of concept of surplus value. But let us return to Marx's text. So it's Marx again, quote, if the worker needs only half a working day in order to live a whole day, then in order to keep alive as a worker, he needs to work only half a day. The second half of the labor day, this labor day, that labor day, is forced labor, surplus Arbeit. What appears as surplus value on capital side appears identically on the worker's side as surplus labor, Maharbeit, in excess of his requirements as worker, hence in excess of his immediate requirements for keeping himself alive. Close quote. For Marx, then, the worker as capital is not the same as the worker as a human being. In the first case, her life consists solely of being utilized as a force of production. In the second case, additional dimensions such as the fulfillment of cultural and spiritual needs need to be taken into account. Here, we already have the seeds of the concept of necessary labor. The more interesting question is how capitalism accomplishes the worker's submission to forced labor without the worker being conscious of this coercion. The key is that capital is able to conceal the relationship of domination at its core under the cloak of wage labor. Now, as far as they're concerned, capital does not exist as capital because autonomous wealth as such can exist only either on the basis of direct forced labor slavery or indirect forced labor, wage labor. Pretty much the only two options. Wealth confronts direct forced labor not as capital, but rather as a relation of domination. Herrschaftsverhältnis. Very hot home. Very hot homeness, whatever. Anyway, close quote. The surplus value produced by the worker for capital is perceived as a fair contract of equal exchange. Capital conceals unpaid surplus labor in the system of wages. This is where the creation, the Einstellung of value, takes place in the form of surplus value. Neither Ricardo, nor the physiocrats, nor Adam Smith managed to grasp this. Only a concept of capital as process makes the appearance of capital possible, both in the context of circulation and in that of production, with its final realization in circulation and its inclusion of the process of production within itself. The important concept here is, of course, process. Quote, capital itself is mediator between production and circulation. Capital is direct unity of product and money, or better, of production and circulation. Thus, it itself is again something immediate, and its development consists of positing and suspending itself as this unity, close quote. Now, because of this, capital hides its process of self-realization from the worker and produces surplus labor in an unequal exchange as if it were equal. After it is objectified, this surplus labor is transformed into surplus value. Subjectively, in the worker, surplus labor is the creator of surplus value as an objective moment of capital as capital. Now, how does capital manage to place this surplus labor at its disposal? Surplus labor and surplus value as a civilizing process. Now, the implication here is, of course, that it's cultural, but we'll get there. Just, hold off. This is one of the issues that you could use a different set of lenses on, for example, Frankfurt School, etc. Now, Marx begins his discussion of this issue in the terms that characterize the fundamental aspects of surplus value, which he would later refer to in the book, Capital. Relative surplus value and absolute surplus value. Now, this is understandable given the discussion above. The surplus value that is not pocketed by the worker nor in full by the capitalist himself is that which results from capital itself, that is, as machinery, for example, to that of constant capital, and not simply from the absolute increase of the time invested in labor, that is, absolute surplus value. The latter is grasped by some consciousness as a relation of domination in its purest and simplest form, is slavery with extra steps. This is why Marx begins with the most developed manifestation of surplus value in order to proceed thereafter, to an exploration of its most primitive level of development, both as a category and as a historical phenomenon. Capital needs more surplus labor to increase its own value. Marx again, quote, "The great historical quality of capital is to create this surplus labor. Superfluous labor from the standpoint of mere use value, mere subsistence, and its historic destiny, Bestimmung, is fulfilled when the development of the productive powers, productive Kraft of labor, which capital incessantly whips onward with its unlimited mania for wealth, have flourished to the stage where the possession and preservation of general wealth require a lesser labor time of society as a whole. Capital's ceaseless striving towards the general form of wealth drives labor beyond the limits of its natural paltriness. Naturbedürftigkeit, and thus creates the material elements for the development of the rich individuality, which is as all-sided in its production as in its consumption, in which natural necessity in its direct form has disappeared, because a historically created need has taken the place of the natural one. This is why capital is productive. It ceases to exist as such only where the development of these productive forces themselves encounters its barrier in capital itself. Hence, the great civilizing influence of capital." Close quote. Progress and civilization in general thus entail the transcendence of established needs, but capital transcends established boundaries not in the service of humanity, but for the increase of the value of capital itself. This is an abstraction, right? Capital's drive is expressed in its, quote, constant movement to create more of the same, that is, surplus value. The quantitative boundary of the surplus value appears to it as a mere natural barrier, as a necessity which it constantly tries to violate, and beyond which it constantly seeks to go. It moves. Its obstacles arise of its own propulsion, when capital finds its barrier in capital itself. To move beyond these limits, the limits of capital, is to increase production. Again, quote, "The increase in the productive force of living labor increases the value of capital or diminishes the value of the worker, not because it increases the quantity of products or use values created by the same labor, but rather because it diminishes necessary labor, notwendigen Arbeit. Hence, in the same relation as it diminishes the former, it creates surplus labor, or what amounts to the same thing, surplus value." Now that's, this can get very tangled. Necessary labor is what enables the worker to consume through the mediation of the money received as the price of her living objectified labor, that is, wages, and to subsist as a worker, as a mere productive force, rather than as a human being. Thus, everything in the shadow of capital is aimed at diminishing the relation of necessary labor to surplus labor, and only in the proportion in which it diminishes this relation. Surplus value is exactly equal to surplus labor. The increase of the one is exactly measured by the diminution of necessary labor. However, it's worth noting that the less time the society requires to produce wheat, cattle, etc., the more time it wins for other productions, material or mental. Economy of time To this, all economy ultimately reduces itself. Marx. Whilst this might be true of human beings who produce collectively, whilst this might be true of human beings who produce collectively for their own benefit as a community, so long as the savings of necessary labor time is based on capital, they consist of living labor and are not for the benefit of humanity, but rather are at the service of a decreased increase, a desired increase, at the service of a desired increase of the value of capital itself. Marx's attention is drawn towards the fact that the saved necessary time and the increase of the value of capital are inversely proportional. And here we glimpse the beginning of a foreseeable crisis in capitalist development. Even if productivity is doubled, the value of capital increases only by half. If necessary labor equals a quarter of the living workday and the productive force doubles, then the value of capital doesn't double, but grows by 1/8, which is equal to 1/4 or 2/8 minus 1/4 divided by 2, or 2/8 minus 1/8 equals 1/8. In this example, productivity doubles, that is an increase of 100%, while surplus value increases from 3/4 of the workday to 7/8 of that workday, from 75% to 87.5%. Surplus value only increases 12.5% versus a 100% increase in productivity. Now, this leads Marx to another conclusion. The larger the surplus value of capital before the increase of productive force, the larger the amount of presupposed surplus labor or surplus value of capital, or the smaller the fractional part of the working day, which forms the equivalent of the worker, which expresses necessary labor, the smaller is the increase in surplus value which capital obtains from the increase of productive force. Close quote. Now, this passage is crucial to understand the questions posed by dependency theory, when capitals compete against each other with varying levels of previously generated surplus value, because the more developed capital already is, the more surplus labor it's created, the more terribly it must it develop the productive form in order to realize itself in only smaller proportion. The civilizing impulse of capital, its desperate need to increase its own value by overcoming new limits that are constantly set at higher levels and ever more distant and difficult to reach, is the product of a tendency that Marx defines as follows, quote, the self-realization of capital becomes more difficult to the extent that it has already been realized, close quote. Now, this analysis is an abstraction insofar as it's based on the systematic removal of many variables. The inclusion of many other concrete variables would change its conclusion, but this actually belongs in the doctrine of profit, which is situated to the most complex and superficial level of circulation. As we can see from Marx, the question of surplus value is situated, on the contrary, in the transition from labor to product as abstract determinations of capital. Next section, increase of the value, relative surplus value, and absolute surplus value. As I previously suggested, Marx is mainly interested in the most hidden form of surplus value, relative surplus value, and here it takes on the visible form of surplus labor. So, quote, if capital has already raised surplus labor to the point where the entire living workday is consumed in the production process, and here we assume that the working day to be the natural amount of labor to which the worker is able to at the disposal of capital, then increase in the productive force cannot increase labor time nor therefore objectified labor time. Now, if the worker labors for 16 hours, he reaches the limits of his endurance, and may become ill or die. It's not possible to increase the natural or absolute limits of surplus labor any further. Instead, by means of the technical increase of productivity, it is possible to achieve higher levels of production within the same period of time, which makes it possible to reduce necessary labor. You can see that this is argued in different ways. AI is often presented in this same context. More Marx. Quote, in this case, its value increased not because the absolute, but because the relative amount of labor grew. Because not the absolute amount of labor, but because the relative amount of labor grew, i.e., the total amount of labor did not grow. The working day is as long before as after. Hence, no absolute increase in surplus time, surplus labor time, rather than the amount of necessary labor decrease. And that is how relative surplus labor increased. Now, the decrease of necessary labor time is equal to the decrease of real wages, since the worker is now paid the same amount for a job that produces more. Here lies the secret of profit in the context of the circulation processes, which are addressed in more detail further on. In these passages, Marx grasps the whole question with greater clarity than before, as evidenced by his observation that, quote, according to Ricardo, the element of the accumulation of capitals is posited just as completely with relative surplus value as with absolute surplus value. Impossible any other way. Then there's a period of surplus time during which surplus labor is carried out and once objectified is then transferred into surplus value. This surplus value is absolute when natural labor time is added to it, i.e., if the worker had worked 10 hours instead of 8 in the earlier relation and had increased his absolute labor time, close quote. It is relative when there is a proportionate relationship between the increase of productivity and the decrease of necessary labor time, and therefore an absolute increase in surplus value, although it involves a decrease in the rate or index of surplus value, as Marx has already begun to discover. Because of this, once there is an increase in value, it becomes increasingly difficult for it to grow further, because capital must apply itself to the task of increasing surplus value with improvements that are too costly. Quote, Marx, every increase in the mass of capital employed can increase the productive force, not only at an arithmetical, but at a geometric rate, although it can increase profit at the same time, only at a much lower rate. The influence of the increase of capital on the increase of productive force is thus infinitely greater than that of the increase on the productive force on the growth of the productive force on the growth of capital. Close quote. Nonetheless, capital manages to find a way to increase its value, not only through relative increases achieved by greater productivity, but also through absolute increases derived from greater amounts of labor time. There are also other ways to, increase value. In motion, it can realize itself as Marx. In motion, it can realize itself only in new living labor, whether labor which had been dormant is set into motion, or new workers are created, that is, population growth is accelerated. Or again, a new circle of exchange values in circulation is expanded, which can occur on the production side if the liberated exchange value, which opens up, if the liberated exchange value opens up a new branch of production, or the same is achieved when objectified labor is put in the sphere of circulation in a new country by an expansion of trade. Note how Marx relates the growth of urban populations to the inclusion of populations in colonial possession as possible modes of capital growth and as elements of the same issue of absolute surplus power. Absolute surplus labor. Ricardo had never referred to population growth as a relevant factor of increases in exchange value. This, in turn, determines a cycle whereby capitals accumulate faster than the population, thus wages rise, thus population thus grain prices, thus the difficulty of production, and hence the exchange values. In the medium term, population growth causes a fall in wages due to an excess supply of living labor. Ultimately, Marx is searching for a solution. He gets sidetracked along the way in certain digressions, goes around in circles at times, turns back on its turns back on its track, starts again, and repeats himself. He advances slowly as we follow in his footsteps. Next section, permanence of the value of the material and instrument of labor. Now, so far, Marx's discourse has relied on two opposite categories. We have always spoken only about the two elements of capital, the two parts of the living workday, of which one represents wages, the other profit, one necessary labor, the other surplus labor. As we can see, Marx equates profit situated at the superficial level of circulation with surplus value, and he analyzes this in the following chapter. So far, Marx has used concepts such as wages and profits, that is, surplus value, together with necessary labor and surplus labor. Now, what is missing are the means of production. Quote, but what about the other two parts of capital in which are realized, or the material of labor and the instrument of labor? Marx. Close quote. This is the beginning of his development of the critical concept of constant capital, which begins shortly thereafter for the quote-unquote first time. But its meaning is not yet clear. In the simple production process, labor always confronting English This is the beginning of his development of the critical concept of constant capital, which appears shortly thereafter for the first time, but its meaning is not yet clear. In the simple production process, labor always employs instruments and materials necessary for its deployment. This is the material of labor, that is raw materials as material, and the instrument, that is from machines to an entire factory, as instrument, i.e. as use values. However, the subsumption of the material instrument is produced as a moment of capital. This autonomous entity is thus ontologically subsumed by capital. Quote, but are they as components als Bestandteil of capital, values which labor must replace? Such objections were heaped upon Ricardo, that he regarded profit and wages only as components of production costs, not the machine itself and the material. Close quote. Clearly, for Marx, the material and the instruments of labor are moments of capital, given that money has been invested or transubstantiated in them. As essential determinations of capital, raw material, or the material and instruments of technology are now moments of capital itself between labor and the product. As capital, both are value. Products as products and exchangeable commodities whose ability to be exchanged is their essence and whose exchange must be produced. The question now is whether this value is destroyed. Which would result in the annihilation of value and thus of capital, or whether it can persist in a modified form, whether it not only persists in a constant form as capital whose value has been preserved, but in fact also as value that can be increased. When mere cotton is transformed, changes form into a garment, the material of the cotton not only disappears, but is also subsumed under an extension thus increasing its value. The creation of new value without the destruction of old value is accomplished by the worker's labor without any cost being incurred by the capitalist. The worker has not created the objectified labor contained in yarn and spindle. For him, they were and remain material to which he gave another form and into which he incorporated new labor. That their old value is preserved happens because a new one is added to them, not that the old is itself reproduced, but it is created. So as the worker transforms the object through her labor, the material at her disposal increases in value, acquires greater value than before, but this is a value placed at the service of capital with no benefits to the worker. Quote, this Marx, like every other nature or social power of labor, unless it is the product of previous labor or of such previous labor as does not need to be repeated, this natural animating, the Benda power of labor becomes a power of capital, not of labor. So far, Marxists explored the question of raw material transformed by labor rather than that of the instrument of labor itself. This is why the concept of constant capital has not emerged. Money, as money, has an autonomous existence at its origin. It is the presupposition of the first appearance of capital. As money transformed into capital and then invested into money, as money, has an autonomous existence at its origin. It is the presupposition of the first appearance of capital. As money transformed into capital and then invested into wages and means of production. This is the second expression of money, but the first expression of capital. As capital, money also appears at the end of the process of production, which includes surplus value as profit. And in its third form, it finds its most adequate expression. Quote, Marx, just as money at first appeared as the presupposition, the cause of capital, so it now appears as its effect. In the first movement, money arose out of simple circulation. In the second, it arises from the production process of capital. In the first, it makes a transition to capital. In the second, it appears as a presupposition of capital posited by capital itself. Close quote. In this conclusion, Marx returns to the starting point of his discussion, money. And in fact, in the end, the increase of value is nothing but the increase of money as a result of the processes of both production and circulation. After the product transformed into a commodity has been sold, and when the value injected at the beginning of the cycle and the profit obtained along the way are both present, including surplus value. Many more pages of his notebooks are dedicated to this. They are the space of realization of Marx's theoretical work, where these concepts are fully developed and expressed with sufficient clarity. We can see then that in December 1857, the formation of several key categories of Marx's theory had already taken on a definitive form, while others were still in the ambiguous state of mere intuitions that had not achieved sufficient conceptual force. His critique of the entire system of categories of bourgeois political economy had already taken crucial steps forward, but his overall task had barely been undertaken when only a month had passed since the moment of clarity, when for the first time in his work, he discovered the category of surplus value. Now, this seems altogether too monumental relative to a single text, and we note, of course, that Marx had multiple notebooks, and so this is another one of those things you have to sort of work through, and the historiography of it. Now, you can see that in the notes, there's other issues related to Ricardo, and I've included, and because it needed to be done, and it has no math, so it should be easier for you to get a sense of. And I will only read part of it because we're getting close to the end time, as well as the end times. An article in a different text by Fred Mosley on the whole and the parts, the early development of Marx's theory of the distribution of surplus value in the Grundrisse by Fred Mosley. I have argued in several recent papers that Marx's theory is based on the fundamental quantitative premise that the total amount of surplus value is determined logically prior to its division into individual parts, equal rates of profit, commercial profit, interest, and rent. And this was sort of the point we were getting in the last book we were dealing with. In other words, the production of surplus value is theorized prior to the distribution of surplus value. There's a clear logical progression from the determination of the magnitude of the total surplus value to the determination of the individual parts. In modern economic terms, there is a progression from the macro to the micro. Now, this is, counterintuitive to the way the kind of standard economy is being presented. But have no fear, as was just recently put up on on social media. The St. Louis Reserve Bank has inverted these relations and essentially allows for the elimination of the concept of the money multiplier, which appears in a significant number of textbooks, neoclassical textbooks, and yet is being criticized, debunked by one of the Federal Reserve Banks, which is actually where it should happen. So, but needless to say, textbooks lag behind. So anyway, back to the text. To take the most important example, in Marx's theory of prices of production in part 2 of volume 3, the total surplus value is taken as given. It's already determined in volumes 1 and 2, and the total surplus value is used to determine the general rate of profit, which is in turn a determinant of prices of production. So as a result, the predetermined total surplus value is distributed to individual industries in such a way that all industries receive the same rate of profit. Now, this premise is very important for Marx because he wished to demonstrate that all the particular forms of surplus value, that is, industrial profit, commercial profit, interest, and rent, all come from the same source, which is surplus labor. Surplus labor is the inner substance of all these different forms of appearance of surplus value. This premise is repeated many times in all the drafts of Capital, especially in the drafts of Volume 3 in the manuscript of 1861 to 63 and the manuscript of 1864 to 5. Other authors who have also emphasized the prior determination of the total surplus value in Marx's theory include who we looked at earlier, Paul Maddock, Roman Rostowski, Dussel, Yaffe, and Dussel above, Yaffe, and Duncan Foley. So Mosley argues, I've argued further that this distinction between the production of surplus value and the distribution of surplus value, it's the quantitative dimension of the two basic levels of abstraction in Marx's theory. This is what I was previewing above. Capital in general and competition. Recall, we were talking about competition earlier, a couple days ago. Capital in general is defined by Marx as those properties which are common to all capitals and which distinguish capital from simple commodities or money and other forms of wealth. The most important common or universal property of all capitals, which is analyzed at the level of abstraction of capital in general, is the production of surplus value, including absolute surplus value and relative surplus value. Now, since this all-important property is shared by all capitals, the theory of the production of surplus value at the level of abstraction of capital in general is concerned with the total surplus value produced by the total capital of society as a whole. Other common properties of all capitals that are analyzed at the level of abstraction of capital in general include various characteristics of capital in the sphere of circulation, that is, turnover time, fixed and circulating capital, etc., and the appearance of surplus value and the rate of surplus value as profit and the rate of profit, including the infamous falling rate of profit. Now, the main question addressed at the level of abstraction of competition is the distribution of surplus value, or the division of the total surplus value into individual parts. Another related question addressed at the level of abstraction of competition is revenue and its sources, or the critique of vulgar political economy's explanation of these individual parts of surplus value. Therefore, that is Fred Mosley, argue that the basic logical structure of Marx's theory of capital in the 3 volumes of Capital is as follows. Note that we've already seen this expressed by Chris Arthur and a bunch of other folks. Number 1, capital in general. And so subsection 1 is production of surplus value, volume 1, circulation of capital, that is turnover time, volume 2, number 3, under capital in general, capital and profit, including the falling rate of profit, that is parts 1 and 3 of volume 3. So that's kind of the capital in general, the way in which you would combine his writings, essentially Engels' organization. So number 2, Roman numeral 2, competition or the distribution of surplus value. Now, to see that as an equivalent, you have to go through several different mechanical sort of adjustments in your theory, but try to think of it that way. The general rate of profit and prices of production are part 2 of volume 3. Commercial profit is part 4 of volume 3. Interest is part 5. 4, rent is part 6, and revenue and its sources, that is the critique of vulgar economics, is part 7. Now, the Grundrisse are almost entirely at the level of abstraction of capital in general. After initial chapter on money, the rest of the Grundrisse is the chapter on capital, which is divided into 3 sections: the production process of capital, the circulation process of capital, and a brief section, 30 pages, mainly about the falling rate of profit on capital as fructiferous. Remember, we read that before. Capital and profit. These 3 sections of the chapter on capital correspond to the 3 sub-levels of capital in general, in the outline above. Now, in addition, there are a number of passing comments and brief discussion in sections 2 and 3 of the chapter on capital that have to do with the distribution of surplus value, mainly the equalization of profit rates across industries, the most important aspect of the distribution of surplus value. In these comments, Marx often stated something like the following: this discussion of the equalization of profit rates does not belong here, but belongs instead to the later analysis of competition. See below. Now, after a brief summary of section 1 of the Grundrisse, this chapter will review in detail these initial comments and discussions in section 2 and 3 of the Grundrisse about the equalization of profit rates and the other component parts of the total surplus value. It will also briefly review several important letters written by Marx in 1858 during the time that he was finishing the Grundrisse. It will be seen that Marx was already very clear at this early stage of his work on Capital, the book, that the subsequent analysis of the equalization of profit rates, and the distribution of surplus value in general would be based on the premise that the total amount of surplus value is determined prior to its distribution and is not affected by its distribution. Now, this idea of projection, this projection of of surplus value is an important one, and does relate to how some people, take their kind of theoretical position on this, and people, kind of divide up their positions on this. So I've reached the end of my little yammering here on this. I will finish this probably on Monday. Look at in the clock weekly Marx is a couple of other contributions on the same topic, that is on the Grundrisse. So that's what weekly Marx on Saturday and Sunday will be spent. So we'll come back to this likely on Monday. Let me thank you for your attention, and I will now shut down the